Well, hello everyone. There's only four of us, but that's okay. It's our first day reading Epictetus, the Discourses, Fragments Handbook, and we're using the Robin Hard translation. Um, I was kind of just going to give a little bit of an introduction just from the introduction of the Hard translation. It's such a good introduction, by the way. If you, Travis and I were discussing it before, and it's really excellent. Um, Most of us know a little bit about Epictetus, but since I'm recording this and someone might watch it, they might not know who Epictetus is. So just quickly, just grab a passage here from the introduction. Epictetus's discourses form one of three compelling statements of Stoic practical ethics from the early Roman Empire. The other two are Seneca's letters and Marcus Aurelius's meditations. Epictetus's work is, in some ways, the most important. Epictetus, unlike the other two thinkers, was a formal Stoic teacher and one of the best known of his age. The discourses in Handbook are forceful, direct, and challenging, and are expressed in a way that is accessible to a very wide range of people. They set out the core ethical principles of Stoicism in a form designed to help people put them into practice and to use them as a basis for leading a good human life. One central message is that the basis for happiness or well-being is up to us, and that we all have the capacity to move towards this state, regardless of our specific social context or individual character. It might be worth pointing out, Judith would know that the Greek is F Hamen, isn't it, for what is up to us, and it causes some controversy in Stoic world. Modern Stoic people often like to debate the difference between the dichotomy of control, which has been made popular by people like William Irvine, I think, and some modern CBT type styled practitioners, and then the more kind of searching kind of look at what F. Hammond might actually kind of mean from an ancient perspective. So it's an interesting debate nonetheless. And yeah, it's quite controversial. Would you say? I think it kind of is.
Yeah, it is, and it regularly comes up, as you say, in groups online. There's a whole one somehow or another, different translations have become standard. So, and I think I'm not really sure, but maybe the Irvine perspective has had something to do with that. This idea about control, which brings its own bunch of valences from in English to the question. But yeah, the first title that's come down to us in Epictetus's Discourse 1 is about those things which are up to us and not up to us. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. All right, that's great. So going on, a related theme to that is that making progress in this direction requires a combination of sustained reflection and hard work, especially in embedding our principles in our actions and relationships. Epictetus also stresses that this capacity forms an integral and inalienable part of what makes human beings distinctive in the natural universe, as well as the prime expression of what is divine within us. So Epictetus's discourses have been the most widely read and influential of all Stoic writings from antiquity onwards. They still speak eloquently to modern readers and have taken on a new significance in recent years as the basis for life guides and cognitive psychotherapy, apparently. And I was reading the Inner Citadel recently, and I believe you were too, Judith. And there's a nice section in there by Pierre Hadot on the influence of Epictetus on Marcus Aurelius. And I was really struck by the importance that Pierre Hadot gives to the three activities of the soul. And I think that comes out really nicely and clearly in the discourses, and these three activities of the soul are obviously capacities, I guess, of F Hammond, things that are up to us, um, and thinking about it in those three aspects, and probably how those three aspects then link to physics, ethics, and logic, the three kind of streams of philosophical discourse in the ancient world. I think that's a very interesting kind of commentary. Did you want to say anything before we sort of jump into it?
No, I think that's a great introduction, Courtney. I will just say that just this week, online, someone's come forward and said how very negative they find Epictetus and very confrontational, and that they find that this is a very counterproductive way of teaching. And they couldn't quite express to me what in particular they were getting at. But this is something maybe we can think of going through, is Epictetus's manner can be abrasive. Do we think that that's like, yeah, can we think about why the reasons that might be? It's to do, it seems to be to do with getting people to really focus on what it is about their lives that is important. But his manner can be quite confrontational. So that's something we could maybe think about as we go through.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing too, which Pierre Hadot mentions, is that in Seneca's letters, you get letters written to a friend or whoever it's supposedly written to. In Marcus Aurelius, you get a diary perhaps written to himself. But in the Discourses, you're getting what's more like not actually the lecture itself, but the discussion after the lecture. So that's an interesting genre in itself, you know, like it's not actually the lecture, which might have been about things that Chrysippus had written about, but instead, yeah, the conversations the students have with the teacher, you know, in the aftermath of the lecture proper. That's quite interesting because that shapes the kind of reading we end up having too. I noticed that, oh, I should tell everyone, our agenda is that depending on how many people turn up, like for example, there's 4 of us here today, we will each read a section or a chapter because they're quite short, and then discuss it. And then once the discussion is, we've had enough with the discussion, we'll move on to the next reader in the next section, and see how many we can get through in our regular sessions, which is about 2 hours. Is that satisfactory to everyone? We're on the same page there? Yeah, cool. And I'm noticing straight away that some of the chapters in the Discourses are longer than others. So this is 2.5 pages, which is not huge. How do we want to break it up? Or do you just reckon we should just read the whole thing? Or do you think we should find natural breaks and just and do it that way? What do you guys reckon?
I'm happy to come to kind of natural breaks. So I think, yeah, some sections are much longer than others. So let's maybe just see how we go. What do you think, Travis?
Yeah, I think so. If we finish a few paragraphs and that feels like a good place to stop, let's just do that.
All right, brilliant. Who wants to go first?
Oh, I can kick off the proceedings.
Awesome.
So book 1, the first part starts with about things that are within our power and those that are not. So among all of the arts and faculties, you'll find none that can take itself as an object of study, and consequently none that can pass judgment of approval or disapproval upon itself. In the case of grammar, how far does its power of observation extend? Only as far as to pass judgment on what is written. And in the case of music, only as far as to pass judgment on the melody. Does either of them, then, make itself an object of study? Not at all. If you're writing to a friend, grammar will tell you what letters you ought to choose. But as to whether or not you ought to write to your friend, grammar won't tell you that. And the same is true of music with regard to melodies. As to whether or not you should sing or play the lyre at this time, that is something the music won't tell you. What will it tell you then? The faculty that takes both itself and everything else as an object of study. And what is that? The faculty of reason. For that alone of all the faculties that we've been granted is capable of understanding both itself, what it is, what it is capable of, and what value it contributes, and all of the other faculties too. For what else is it that tells us that gold is beautiful? For the gold itself doesn't tell us. It is clear then that this is the faculty that has the capacity to deal with impressions. What else can judge music, grammar, and the other arts and faculties, and assess the use that we make of them, and indicate the proper occasions for the use? None other than this. It was fitting then that the gods have placed in our power only the best faculty of all, the one that rules over all the others, that which enables us to make right use of our impressions. But everything else they haven't placed within our power. Was it that they didn't want us to? I think for my part that, if they could, they would have entrusted those other powers to us too. But that was something that they just couldn't do. For in view of the fact that we're here on earth and are shackled to a body like our own and to such companions as we have, how could it possibly be that, in view of all of that, we shouldn't be hampered by external things? But what does Zeus have to say about this? If it had been possible, Epictetus, I would have ensured that your poor body and petty possessions were free and immune from hindrance. But as things are, you mustn't forget that this body isn't truly your own, but is nothing more than cleverly molded clay. But since I couldn't give you that, I've given you a certain portion of myself, this faculty of motivation to act and not to act, of desire and aversion, and, in a word, the power to make proper use of impressions. If you pay good heed to this and entrust all that you have to its keeping, you will never be hindered, never obstructed, and you'll never groan, never find fault, and never flatter anyone at all. What, does all of that strike you as being of small account? Certainly not. So you're content with that. I pray so to the gods. But as things are, though we have it in our power to apply ourselves to one thing alone and devote ourselves to that, we choose instead to apply ourselves to many things and attach ourselves to many, to our body, our possessions, and our brother and friend and child and slave. And so, being attached in this way to any number of things, we're weighed down by them and dragged down. That is why, if the weather prevents us from sailing, we sit there in a state of anxiety, constantly peering around. What wind is this? The north wind? And what does it matter to us and to him? When will the west wind blow? When it so chooses, my good friend, or rather, when Aeolus chooses. For God hasn't appointed you to be controller of the winds. He has appointed Aeolus. What are we to do then? To make the best of what lies within our power and deal with everything else as it comes. How does it come then? As God wills. What, am I to be beheaded now, and I alone? Why would you want everyone else to be beheaded for your consolation? Aren't you willing to stretch out your neck, as Laternius did at Rome when Nero ordered that he should be beheaded? For he stretched out his neck, received the blow, and when it proved to be too weak, shrank back for an instant, but then stretched out his neck again. And moreover, on an earlier occasion, when Epaphroditus came to him and asked him why he had fallen out with the emperor, came to him, he replied, "If I care to, I'll explain that to your master." What then should we have at hand to help us in such emergencies? Why, what else than to know what is mine and what isn't mine, and what is in my power and what isn't? I must die, so must I die groaning too? I must be imprisoned, so must I grieve at that too? I must depart into exile, so can anyone prevent me from setting off with smile, cheerfully and serenely? Tell me the secrets. I won't reveal them, for that lies within my power. Then I'll have you chained up. What are you saying, man? Chain me up? You can chain my leg, but not even Zeus can overcome my power of choice. I'll throw you into prison. You mean my poor body? I'll have you beheaded. Why, did I ever tell you that I'm the only man to have my neck that can't be severed? These are the thoughts that those who embark on philosophy ought to reflect upon. It is these that they should write about every day, and it is these that they should train themselves. Thrasea was in the habit of saying, I'd rather be killed today than to be sent into exile tomorrow. So what did Rufus say in reply? If you choose death as being the heavier misfortune, what a foolish choice that is. If you choose it as being the lighter, who has granted you that choice? Aren't you willing to be content with what is granted to you? So what was it that Agrippinus used to say? I won't become an obstacle to myself. The news was brought to him that your case is being tried in the Senate. May everything go well. But the 5th hour has arrived. This was the hour in which he was in the habit of taking his exercise and then having a cold bath. So let's go off and get some exercise. When he had completed his exercise, someone came and told him, You've been convicted. To exile, he asked, or to death? To exile. What about my property? It hasn't been confiscated. Then let's go away to Arica and eat our meal there. This is what it means to train oneself in the matters in which one ought to train oneself, to have rendered one's desires incapable of being frustrated and one's aversions incapable of falling into what they want to avoid. I'm bound to die. If at once, I'll go to my death. If somewhat later, I'll eat my meal, since the hour has arrived for me to do so, and then die afterwards. And how? As suits someone who is giving back that which is not his own.
Thanks, Travis. Well, you got through the whole thing.
Yeah, it was just flowing so nicely. I was like,
Yeah,
let's just
good
keep
job.
going.
I'm just going to go back to the start of the text, because there's a lot there, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the thing about Epictetus is you think, oh, this is so simple. Oh, it's actually not, It's so, even the Greek is not simple. People say, oh, well, Epictetus writes in Koine Greek, so it's the common Greek that everyone was speaking. And it's like, yeah, okay, but it's very sophisticated syntax and thought processes expressed, in quite complex sentences. So, but yeah, I mean, he jumps straight in, right? It's the fact among all the faculties, the one that's important is the one about, the faculty of what is it about all these pursuits, grammar, writing your letter, music, all these studies don't reflect upon themselves. They don't give a justification for themselves. It's the only thing that can do that is the power of reason. That's the power in which the gods have given to us.
And in a related way, last week we read Thomas Nagel's What's It Like to Be a Bat? And this in a way has a similar kind of feeling, because he's saying there's many things out there like subjects or objects, which are just objects of some subjective experience, really. And that subjective thing, the experience of the reasoning being, for example, doesn't make an object of itself. It is able to view the things in the world and have feelings about them and thoughts about them and weigh them up and measure them in various ways. And I think that's really gets to the heart of a very important feature about the governing faculty that he'll later expand on, right?
Yeah, what was interesting though is, and part of the reason why I just wanted to read the whole passage in the end, is that it actually has this musical flair to it. Like there is a rhythm to the way that this passage has been set out, which is interesting because we can't just rely on that alone, but it's also that style that just makes it really enjoyable at the same time. So at this, I think it just contrasts nicely because it's like you have to write everything and analyze your impressions and make use of your reason, and you can't just play a melody, but it's precisely how this is structured that has that really lovely tone that helps you to then, think more about the text and what it is that we're looking at.
Yeah, definitely. And in that first paragraph too, Judith, where he says, the faculty of reason, for that alone, of all the faculties that we've been granted, is capable of understanding both itself, what it is capable of, what value it contributes, and all the other faculties too. For what else is it that tells us that gold is beautiful? For the gold itself doesn't tell us. So in there, we're already getting part of it. Like, the world's real. There's no debate about that. There's a physicalism behind this philosophy. The world's really real. The objects in the world are real. We're real. But it's not the gold that tells us it's beautiful. So there's something about our investigation of objects or things in the world that already we're seeing here, is that it requires us. It requires our rational faculty to be able to form judgments about objects. It's not that the objects themselves completely disclose what they are to us without some sort of intervention on reason's behalf. And that becomes a really important feature. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Courtney. And you can just kind of imagine, the students are just sitting there, just wondering, oh, this Epictetus, yes, what's this course going to be about? And he just goes, bang, right, this is about your faculty of judgment. There's no two ways about it. There's no beating around the bush. This is what you're being given. And yes, I think you're absolutely right. He's pointing out, and it would be great to have a little more of his discussion around this idea of the gold not telling us, because this comes down to our ideas around value, its ideas around aesthetics. What is it about the gold that is beautiful, and what is it that attracts us about the gold? Is it because we know that it's valuable in the real world, or for want of a better term, or is it because we're responding to something, responding to beauty? Is that what's going on here? But whatever it is, he's getting us to think about it. It's around our impressions.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And this is the only faculty, as he points out. It was section 7. It was fitting then that the gods have placed in our power only the best faculty of all, the one that rules over all the others, that which enables to make right use of our impressions, because that comes, that's such a key point, isn't it? Because as we see in other aspects of Stoicism, there are so many things that the indifference, I guess, the things that we come across day to day, which are capable or afford either a good use or a bad use, or a better use and a worse use. And it's up to us to make the better use of the impressions. That's what he's trying to underline here.
Yeah, and I think part of being able to make right use of impressions, if we understand that there's a kind of holism in the Stoic worldview, that we aren't mental bodies separate from objects in the world, but somehow we're embedded in the world around us. What that means is being in the world makes the world knowable. The world really is real, and we can discover it if we manage our use of things appropriately, which is very different from the opposition. The skeptic school is going to say that, well, no, there's just this completely unknowable gap between us and the world, and we can't possibly work out what it is. And so they're saying, no, well, we're really embedded in things. So it's as if one thing was made to fit another thing by nature, and by examining the right use of reason and educating ourselves in the use of it, the thing itself is able to reveal itself as what it is for us, for our human soul, not for a dead thing, but for us, a living, rational being. So yeah, I think it's so deep and complex. And you even get that feel for that kind of the nature of it all by the way he uses Zeus, as the one who gives us this power. You can see how people kind of get annoyed by this use of the divine, and I guess if we were to get rid of God out of the picture, so we weren't, disturbed by our kind of Christian imaginations or whatever, it nonetheless suggests that the world is sort of structured in an orderly kind of way, which is at least benign to the human organism.
Yeah, and potentially intelligible. That's the other thing, if we didn't think it was potentially intelligible, why would we have science? Why would we endeavor to investigate it? So we must at least think that there's a discernible order, however we think that may have come about.
And that this governing faculty, this use of reason, somehow plays the perfect bridge between the macrocosmic world, the world as a, the cosmic whole, and also the world as lived in by human beings.
I think as well, there's also a passage kind of hidden there within the context of bringing in Zeus. It's also just to point out that we are brought into the world and we will experience things that aren't perfect because our body isn't actually truly our own and is being molded by clay. And in the case of Epictetus, he's saying, well, you've got your body, and I can't even guarantee you, nor will I, that it'll be free and immune from hindrance. So I think just the bringing forward that concept early on as well, that not only is it not going to be perhaps perfect in our own expectations, but we have to be careful around the reason or the judgments that we make around those things.
Yeah, absolutely, Travis. And I was going to point out in the Greek, and this is really interesting to me because this is something that it's kind of a verbal technique of Marcus Aurelius. So when he refers to, and this comes out quite a few times in the Meditations, when he refers to his body, it's always somation. Now, the word for body in Greek is soma, but somation is a little body. And so he's always downplaying it. And here it's in Epictetus as well. So in section 10, where Epictetus is voicing Zeus, if it had been possible, Epictetus, I would have ensured that your poor body, kaitos somation, your little body, it's kind of a downplaying and a kind of indicating the insignificance of the body by using that. It's called a diminutive, making it seem like a small thing. But yeah, that verbal habit of Marcus obviously comes straight from Epictetus.
And that ties nicely into Pierre Hadot's commentary on the spiritual exercises, because there you see something that Marcus talks about in taking an objective view towards the things that otherwise might concern you. So either the cosmic or the objective perspective would be that the body itself is a thing that passes away, and therefore is not a thing of great worry for us, that we could somehow distance ourselves from it and look at its concerns from almost a slightly removed point of view, a diminutive point of view, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just segueing into that in part 12. So here he outlines what Pierre Hadot is quite interested in. He's talking about the three activities of the soul, which are part of the rational faculty. He says, but since I couldn't give you that, this to live forever, immune from hindrance, I've given you a certain portion of myself, this faculty of motivation to act and not to act, of desire and aversion, and in a word, the power to make proper use of impressions. Those three are the three active parts of the soul. If you pay good heed to this and entrust all that you have to its keeping, you'll never be hindered, never obstructed, and you'll never groan, never find fault, and never flatter anyone at all. So by training these three activities of the soul, we're able to have a soul that's able to discourse with the objects of the world in a manner that's able to reveal what objects actually mean for a rational human soul. Do you think that sounds not too far out?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And interestingly, is it in Cicero today? I was just reading it was on in De Finibus, this idea of hindrance, or rather that the wise person is not going to be hindered, it's not going to be obstructed. That comes out there. So I think, yeah, that's a key notion. And I think it's key because it's one of those impressions that tend to trip people up. You know, that people often think they're personally being prevented or hindered or obstructed by something or somebody, or it's this idea. Yeah, this hindrance idea is kind of it's a real how not to, I guess, from a kind of a Stoic perspective. You know, let's not think we're obstructed when we're actually not. We do have more agency than we often reflect that we do.
And I
Yeah.
can't find the specific passage in my speed read, but there was even something in there around, you know, looking to the obstacle, but I just can't find it now.
Yeah. And part of it goes on to say that, and this is the next step really, isn't it? That we've got this this faculty which was given to us almost as a consolation for having to live in a world that eventually passes away. Our bodies will be impeded and kind of affected by the normal chain of cause and effect around us. But on the other hand, if we align our desires with the natural reality of things, then we're not going to be disturbed by them. So there's this idea of seeing the causal events of the world as almost like fated by like a divine plan. I mean, maybe that's just a kind of providential way of looking at it, but in reality, it's just saying really that, you know, things cause other things to happen. Those things aren't up to us. We're going to pass away. Our bodies will die. We'll get sick. We'll be physically hindered in various ways. So the best way to deal with those things is to understand that there's a part of you that can't be hindered, but the other part, the physical aspect of being, for example, one should have a certain attitude towards that, to accept as if what happens to you is what you desired in the first place, to put your will in alignment with the will of nature. And we would call that acceptance nowadays. And it's a radical, well, no, it's not a radical form of acceptance because we still have complete autonomy over our use of reason, our ability to choose the view of things that fits, you know, the rational scenario. But everything else that's not up to us, well, then we have a complete acceptance about. It's really quite elegant. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and the section 16 is really you know, brilliant observation. Basically, people get impatient around real world things like the weather, you know, because they can't travel or whatever. You know, which wind's that blowing? It's the north wind or the west wind or whatever. These things are definitely not something we have control over, but this is the kind of thing that people get worked up about. And as he says, if we sit there in a state of anxiety, constantly peering around, yes, that's the kind of thing that happens. People aren't kind of thinking through properly that which wind is blowing is not something they've got power over. And for instance, it might be to do with whether your plane can take off, or, you know, to translate it to our terms, or whether your plane's delayed. Yep, these things happen. But as he says at the end of section 17, how does this happen? Pos on perfulken in the Greek. Hos an hoseos thele, as the God wills. And then he interestingly sort of segues to kind of the protest culture in Rome, essentially. So we've got Lateranus, we've got Thrasea, we've got who else? Rufus, Musonius Rufus. The people who basically stand up to power, but by using their power of reason, by making their decision that they're not going to go along with whatever is expected of them. Section 26, Thrasea was in the habit of saying, "I'd rather be killed today than be sent into exile tomorrow." Now, both of those options were kind of standard for philosophers under Nero and Domitian, and he made his choice. Musonius Rufus went into exile, and then there's this Agrippinus, who was another philosopher. Yeah, it's kind of a protest, but also a radical acceptance of what turns out to be decided by the powers that be, whether that's execution or exile, or whether it's time. Yeah, if it's exile, okay, we'll do that now, and then, but we might want to eat lunch first. It's very kind of casual, but it's a powerful use of the moral agency that we all have. Epictetus is reminding us, you know, we all have the same agency as Thrasea, Rufus, and Agrippinus. We all have that power to make those decisions.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, because at the heart of this is a deterministic universe where there's no moral choice in the external world because there's no choice available there. It's all fated. But within the use of reason is basically the only domain in which moral choice can exist. And that means that there's no such thing as good or evil in the external world, but there is good and evil in the ways in which we use reason, because that's the focal point on which choice plays out for a human rational being. The choice to see things the way they actually are. So it's so transformative, that view, that Epictetus is saying, even in the most extreme cases of things, so long as you're guarding and using reason well, then you can't fall into any kind of moral evil. And like Plato said, a good man cannot be touched by evil even in death. And that's what you see here, is really invoking the spirit of Socrates even through these other characters, that a lot of people would say, it's such an injustice, look at this terrible thing that's happening to this person. In the background, there's always the idea that, well, he's aware that people die anyway, no one lives forever. But against the super agency of moral choice, well, no harm has ever come to them by someone else chaining them up or chopping off their head, because those things are just things that happen in the world. They have no real moral power inherent in themselves, but the way they dealt with them highlighted their agency and made them truly morally good agents in the world. In a way, they're victors. They're cast as the heroes in the story, and it says something, we have to assume, about the quality of their soul. And maybe here we're not really talking about things like the afterlife, but definitely about the mark they leave on their fellow citizens and on the body of the kind of public imagination, for example. Those sorts of things are really important, I think, to the Stoic.
Yeah, I mean, these are all Stoic role models, Stoic and philosophical role models. They weren't all Stoics. So yeah, and of course Epictetus was exiled as well, you know, because he wouldn't stop teaching, so he was exiled too. So yeah, I mean, that when people are often convinced they have no choice, or they convince themselves they have no choice in a situation, well, they actually do. It's just that the choice can be very serious. It can be around whether you have a career or not, or whether you are imprisoned, or whether you, in the most extreme cases, are at risk of torture or death. And certainly that's the case for some people in the world currently. So yeah, Epictetus is only drawing our attention, I guess, to these important role models of acting virtuously and with agency.
Yeah, and there's this point here too about even when you know something terrible is going to happen, well, you get rid of that view because it's inconsequential. And despite that, you're made by nature to be involved in social affairs. So even if you just found out you're going to be beheaded tomorrow, there's still things that need to be done. You still go to the bath, you still have lunch, you still hang out with your friends and do the normal social things that you would otherwise do, because that's what it means to be a rational being who makes good use of moral choice. So that's why in his story, Agrippinus is able to go about his affairs in a natural way. And that's why he says, I won't become an obstacle to myself, which is very similar to what Marcus Aurelius says when he says, I won't use my imagination to add to my troubles, you know? And that's what the external world is doing for us. If there's no, like the gold can't tell us that it's beautiful. So likewise, a thing in the world, an event or a person can't speak for itself and say, I'm a terrible, evil thing, but rather we're making some sort of false representation about the nature of that thing, forgetting that the only thing that really matters is our agency and our moral choice to be able to make the best of things and see things as they are for a human being.
I'm happy to read on section 1 too if
Yeah, get into it.
Okay, 1.2, how one may preserve one's proper character in everything. For a rational being, only what is contrary to nature is unendurable, while anything that is reasonable can be endured. Blows are not by nature unendurable. How so? Look at it in this way. Spartans will put up with a beating in the knowledge that it is a reasonable punishment. But to be hanged, isn't that past bearing? When someone feels it to be reasonable, though, he'll go off and hang himself. In short, if we look with due care, we'll find that there is nothing by which the rational creature is so distressed as by that which is contrary to reason, and that conversely, there is nothing to which he is so attracted as that which is reasonable. But these concepts of the reasonable and unreasonable mean different things to different people, as do those of good and bad and the profitable and unprofitable. It is for that reason above all that we have need of education, so as to be able to apply our preconceptions of what is reasonable and unreasonable to particular cases in accordance with nature. Now, to determine what is reasonable or unreasonable, not only do we have to form a judgment about the value of external things, but we also have to judge how they stand in relation to our own specific character. It is thus reasonable for one person to hold out a chamber pot for another, simply in view of the fact that if he fails to do so, he'll get a beating and no food, but will suffer no rough or painful treatment if he does hold it. Whereas for another person, it won't just seem intolerable to hold out a pot himself, but even to allow someone else to do it for him. If you ask me then, shall I hold out the pot or not? I'll reply that it is of greater value to get food than not to get it, and a worse thing to be beaten than not to be beaten. So if you measure your interest by these standards, you should go and hold out the pot. Yes, but that would be beneath me. It is for you to take that further point into consideration, not me, since you're the one who knows yourself and knows that what value you set on yourself and at what price you'll sell yourself. For different people sell themselves at different prices. That's why when Florus was considering whether he should attend Nero's show to perform some part in it himself, Agrippina said to him, "Go." And when Florus asked him, "Then why aren't you going yourself?" he replied, "Because I'm not even considered." For as soon as anyone begins to consider such questions, assessing and comparing the values of external things, he comes near to being one of those people who have lost all sense of their proper character. What are you asking me then? Is death or life to be regarded as preferable? I answer life. Pain or pleasure? I answer, pleasure. But if I don't agree to play a role in the tragedy, I'll lose my head. Go and play the role then, but I won't play one. Why? Because you regard yourself as being just one thread among all the threads in the tunic. So what follows? You should consider how you can be like other people. Just as one thread doesn't want to be marked out from all the other threads. But for my part, I want to be the purple, the small gleaming band that makes all the rest appear splendid and beautiful. Why do you tell me then to be like everything else? In that case, how shall I still be the purple? Helvidius Priscus saw this too, and having seen it, acted upon it. When Vespasian sent word to him to tell him not to attend a meeting of the Senate, he replied, "It lies in your power not to allow me to be a senator, but as long as I remain one, I have to attend the meetings. Well, if you do attend, hold your tongue. If you don't ask my opinion, I'll hold my tongue. But I'm bound to ask you. And I, for my part, must reply as I think fit. But if you do, I'll have you executed. Well, when have I ever claimed to you that I'm immortal? You fulfill your role, and I'll fulfill mine. It is yours to have me killed, and mine to die without a tremor. It is yours to send me to exile, and mine to depart without a qualm." What good, you ask, did Priscus achieve then, being just a single individual? And what does the purple achieve for the tunic? What else than standing out in it as purple and setting a fine example for all the rest? Another man, if he'd been told by Caesar to stay away from the Senate in such circumstances, would have replied, "Thank you for excusing me." But Caesar wouldn't have tried to stop such a man from going to the Senate in the first place, knowing that he would either sit there like a jug, or else if he did speak, would say exactly what he knew Caesar would want him to say, piling on plenty more in addition. It is in this way that a certain athlete behaved too when he was in danger of dying if his genitals weren't cut off. His brother, who was a philosopher, came to him and said, "Well, brother, what are you planning to do? Are we to cut off this part of you and go to the gymnasium as usual?" But the athlete wouldn't submit to that, but set his mind against it and died. When someone asked, how did he do that? Was it as an athlete or as a philosopher? Epictetus replied, as a man, and as a man who had been proclaimed as victor at Olympia, and has fought his corner there, and had passed his life in such places, rather than merely having oil smeared over him at Batten's training ground. But But another man would be willing even to have his head cut off if it were possible for him to live without a head. This is what is meant by acting according to one's character, and such is the weight that this consideration acquires among those who make a habit of introducing it into their deliberations. Come now, Epictetus, shave off your beard. If I'm a philosopher, I'll reply, I won't shave it off. Then I'll have you beheaded. If it please you to do so, have me beheaded. Someone asked, then how will each of us come to recognize what is appropriate to his own character? How is it, replied Epictetus, that when a lion attacks, the bull alone is aware of its own might and hurls itself forward on behalf of the entire herd? Isn't it clear that the possession of such power is accompanied at the same time by an awareness of that power? And in our case too, if someone possesses such power, he won't fail to be aware of it. And yet a bull doesn't become a bull all at once, any more than a man acquires nobility of mind all at once. No, he must undergo hard winter training, and so make himself ready, rather than hurl himself without proper thought into what is inappropriate for him. I'll just better check how much more is in section 2 here, because we're going on a bit. Oh, yeah, no, there's only one more page. Okay. Where was I? Yeah. Only consider at what price you're willing to sell your power of choice. If nothing else, make sure, man, that you don't sell it cheap. But what is great and exceptional is perhaps the province of others, of Socrates and people of that kind. Why is it then, if we are fitted by nature to act in such a way, all or many of us don't behave like that? Well, do all horses become swift running, or all dogs quick on the scent? And therefore, because I'm not naturally gifted, shall I therefore abandon all effort to do my best? Heaven forbid. Epictetus won't be better than Socrates, But even if I'm not too bad, that is good enough for me. For I won't ever be a Milo either, and yet I don't neglect my body, nor a Croesus, and I don't neglect my property. Nor in general do I cease to make any effort in regard whatever merely because I despair of achieving perfection.
Yeah, very good. Again, there's a lot in here. So going right back, yeah. So basically, for a rational being, he says right at the beginning, right? What is contrary to nature is unendurable. But the problem here that he kind of highlights, right, is that for different people, different things are reasonable. And that's kind of, yeah, that's kind of the issue at hand here, right? In short, if we look with due care, we'll find that there is nothing by which the rational creature is so distressed as by that which is contrary to reason, and that conversely there is nothing to which he is so attracted as that which is reasonable. You can kind of hear the modern CBT therapist kind of thinking about how a person can do quite kind of very destructive behaviors because they appear to be reasonable to them in that particular moment. And that's kind of what gets raised here, isn't it? About whether you're going to be the kind of guy who holds the pot or not. Is how, even though it appears reasonable to you, perhaps you lack the right kind of character or the right kind of education to be an appropriate judge of reasonableness and unreasonableness. And I remember this comes up in Nussbaum's Therapy of Desire, as she had that discussion around sometimes when people talk about false impressions, they talk about them as if they were irrational. But the point she makes is that in one sense, they're irrational because they're not in line with nature, but in another sense, they're completely rational because they are comprised of beliefs and opinions and stuff like that. So I think you see that kind of thing here too, is that everything that everyone does, whether it's good or bad, is rational and uses belief and opinions. It's just whether or not they apply their belief and opinions appropriately, and whether they do or not says something about the kind of character they have. Sorry for my long-winded rant there. What do you think?
I think it was a case for me, the way I kind of heard it was also just increasing your own knowledge and experience, so then you can even update your own judgments and impressions along the way. So if you were starting out, or if you're in, certain circumstances, well, then it'd be completely reasonable to, be the chamberlain and hold out the pot, because you're in a situation and you have to do what you have to do. But I was thinking of it more in terms of the soldier as an example. So if you have come to the conclusion that your character is one that you need to serve and protect your country, then you will willingly endure, a very harsh winter and training program where another person, would just crumble at the first hour of the watch. But based on the path they're heading down, they both made impressions or judgments that are reasonable to them based on where it is that they're going. So it's this interesting idea around, okay, well, if everyone is going to have a reasonable impression, how do we get it in a way that we're taking in the right knowledge and we are acting according to the not like correct, but how are we acting in accordance to nature so that we are, living out the right philosophy for us?
Yeah, that's well put, I think, Travis. I think the whole chamber pot thing is pretty funny, really, because we've all had people say to us, "Oh, I've had to do this in my job. Is that, I feel bad. I feel I'm being taken advantage of." And it's like, well, yes, this is how people talk about their jobs and how they kind of try to rationalize it to themselves. And so Epictetus just short circuits through all that and says, well, you know, you got to decide if you're going to hold the pot. and, and it kind of, yeah, forces people to think about, well, am I the kind of person who holds someone's chamber pot while they climb the bloody ladder while I'm left holding the can? Or am I not that kind of person? I mean, I think there's a whole lot of life knowledge embodied in this one anecdote around the chamber pot. And as he says, different people sell themselves at different prices. I mean, it's so true, right? Different people have a different idea of what they're worth. Different people are prepared to compromise on their principles for different reasons. And if you watch people over time, some people will compromise very cheaply, and some people will take a bit more before they compromise. But yeah, I think, you know, there's a whole lot of very shrewd observation going on here. And I thought it was really interesting, and particularly in terms of our discussion around, or our thoughts around Stoic treatment of the indifference, right? So, you know, technically, well, health or wealth are indifferent. Yeah, but as Epictetus says here in section 15 onwards, so what do you ask me? Is death or life to be regarded as preferable? I answer life. Pain or pleasure? I say pleasure. You know, other things being equal, yeah, we want to keep living, and we want to, you know, have a more pleasant way of living. But you know, we're taking into account this whole idea around the purple. It's a very famous image of being the purple, the thread in the bigger fabric, which is a metaphor, obviously, for society, being someone who stands out as a bit different, someone who stands out as a bit principled, someone who stands out as a bit better. He wants to be the purple. If I'm going to be like everyone else, how am I going to be the purple? If you want to be like everyone else, well, you're not going to stand out for moral or other distinction. And then he, again, in parallel to the first section where he talked about Epictetus, here he talks about Helvidius Priscus, who's another of the Stoic martyrs. And Vespasian said, well, if you go to the Senate, well, I'm going to have to do this. And he says, well, I'm going to have to do that, because that was his character and his principles. So what good did he achieve? You know, what good did Priscus achieve by being just a single person, just one person defying Vespasian? Well, what good is the purple? What good is the one person who stands out from the crowd? Again, if Helvidius Priscus had been the kind of yes man, Vespasian wouldn't have wanted, you know, wouldn't have even considered whether he was at the Senate or not. That's what being different in a good way, standing out from the crowd for your superior moral values, is what he's talking about here.
Yeah, I agree. And I just wanted to add a little bit to it. What you were talking about there with the chamber pot. Yeah, that's a really good point. Some people sell themselves short. And this is really the start of the critique of the common opinion, because they don't know that they have this divine part, which is the power to form truly moral choices about things, because they have this rational part. They don't know that the world itself doesn't factor into that kind of, well, doesn't have any inherent moral power to itself, but rather it's how we use it, or the way we make use of reason, that's where the choice, that's where the moral power is formed, that's where our character is kind of developed. And those people who sell themselves short are just completely unaware of that they're sitting on that kind of agency, that freedom, which turns into virtue, which turns into happiness. They don't know about it. And then on the other hand, like he says, some people are worried about getting whipped or whatever like that. So some people sell themselves short because they don't know, but then there are other people who act just because of the fear of the consequences or the desire for gain. Well, those people are just as bad off as the first one, really. And so he gives us, well, what's the appropriate view? And like you said, Judith, the appropriate view is to look at things in a slightly different way from what the common opinion would suggest, and that is using the metaphor of the thread, right? You just think that you're one piece of thread, that's your problem, and that's why you don't see the truth, and that's why you sell yourself short, or that's why you fall for the fear of outcomes and things like that. So yeah, I think that's really interesting because it goes back to F. Hammond again, the things that are up to us.
Yeah, and everyone's got the potential to be the purple, right? Everyone's got the potential to be someone who stands out from the crowd because of their principles or their right decision making. It's just most people don't, because as you say, they're not even aware that they have that capacity.
And that's where the pedagogy comes in. Like, we must be educated in philosophy. We must learn the principles in order to be able to get our reason going well enough that we can critique the common opinion and be able to put these things up for analysis, these things that people just take for granted.
It's also interesting in some respects, though, with the example around speaking at the Senate, because and then being told, not to, but I'm a senator, so I have to go and speak, is the idea that sometimes you're just kind of compelled to carry out the role that you've been assigned, which in this text has a certain appeal to it. But I also know if I was in that situation, I would fold because I just would not want to go home and be said to my wife, sorry, I had to finish that thought and now I'm getting executed tomorrow, but had to do it. So it's challenging anyway around, yeah, I would fold, even though I understand that you have times in your life where you should be compelled to do things because of the role you've been thrust into.
Yeah, I do get the feeling that it is a fairly uncompromising view as it gets presented, especially by Epictetus. What do you think, Judith? Do you think Seneca's as uncompromising when it comes to standing up to authority and not ever sacrificing your autonomy? You know what I mean? Or do you think
Yeah,
it's more
I mean,
severe here?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think Epictetus is more confrontational simply because he's playing a different role. He's teaching young aristocrats who are going to be they're going to be the senators of tomorrow, and they're going to be placed in moral dilemmas by autocrats, because that's what the emperors were. If you got a good one, well, great. But if you didn't, then you were going to be placed in a situation where you either had to go along, you could be all the other threads in the fabric, or you could stand out and be the purple and possibly attract execution. So I think it was a different kind of audience. Seneca in the letters is either talking to his close friend or he's talking to himself, or both. So it's a less confrontational situation, but also the context of the letters is that he's already made the choice. He's already left the court, and he's essentially he's a non-person by the time he's writing the letters. So in a sense, yeah, he's made that decision. He's been the purple, even though he hasn't he hasn't got any credit for it, but that, obviously that's not the point. But yeah, I think by the time Seneca's writing the letters, he's exiled himself effectively from the court. So he's living that as well. But yes, Epictetus is more in your face about it, simply because he's talking to young men at the start of their careers, and trying to influence them to think about what's going to face them in those careers.
And this idea about the purple thread, purple stripe, is quite interesting because I think there's a few different ways you could possibly think about it. And one of them is obviously a bit of a what's the word, elitist kind of perspective. But another way, probably a more reasonable way that I think it's meant, is that the common opinion of things is just flat out wrong. And that in contrast, when you live a life according to reason, when you use reason correctly, you understand the distinction between things not up to you and things that belong to you, and that a human being, a rational being, is really about learning how to use moral choice effectively in the world. If you know that and you live that way, and that's natural to you, and you wouldn't compromise that autonomy, then everybody else is kind of mad and just disruptive and doing things that are completely counterproductive. But from their perspective, the philosopher living like that is some sort of weirdo purple stripe. You see, you know what I mean? In a way, there's this sense in which, oh, well, not everyone could be the purple stripe. You still need to have the white in the robe. Otherwise, it would just be a purple robe. And I think later on you get ideas like that in Epictetus, where he says, well, Stoicism's not for everyone, because, you know, there's just going to be some people that don't get it, or it doesn't appeal to them, or maybe it's something in the character. I don't know. There's something about it is a kind of thing that not everyone's going to be able to gravitate towards. But on the other hand, I guess this is a problem I have. Isn't there this kind of feeling that if it's the right way to think and the right way to picture what it is to be a human being with its human capacities, isn't that for everyone? Shouldn't we all be aiming for that? I don't know. Like, obviously, it's a silly question, but you know what I mean? It's just one of those ones that troubles me.
Yeah, I think so what you're saying is that you know, there's not going to be a whole cohort of purple stripes, right? There's going to be 90% white fabric and 1% purple stripes in every kind of walk of life.
Even though it seems natural, it's the right way to be. You're normal if you're the purple stripe. Purple stripe.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. The thing is, we don't know how many, I suppose, of Epictetus' students actually went on to follow Stoic lifestyles, and if so, how many of those were kind of, you know, had important public offices or whatever. And so, I mean, in a sense, we're not really seeing the full impact of what he was saying. But I think, I mean, are you suggesting, Courtney, that it wasn't a practical kind of approach, or it was?
Oh, no. I just mean that if they're making statements about the normative nature of a human being, you know, like if we developed normally and appropriately and we weren't restricted by social teaching, or, you know, we weren't misled by the appearance of things, this is the way a human being would understand themselves, and this is how they'd go about things. That would be like just normal. That's what it means to be a human being. But in fact, there's this kind of strange scenario in the world that the philosopher, as it's put forward by the Stoic, is a weirdo. He's an oddbod, but he's also a virtuous exemplar. But really what he's doing from a normative point of view is just being a normal human being. I'm just sort of, I can see the paradox there. That's sort of what I'm getting at. I'm not really framing this very well. I guess the point is, what do we do about the fact that most people can't live that way?
Well, maybe they can, though. That's the point. Maybe they can, and they just don't kind of get it.
So how do we help them get it? How do you get them to contemplate exile and death and poverty?
Well, I think people, I mean, you've come, you know, you meet people all the time, Courtney, in your line of work or your line of life, where they have been, you know, upended by life events, yeah, it doesn't have to be exile or ruin to sort of shake the foundations in a sense. Everybody's potentially in that position where they could benefit from a more accurate, a more correct view of externals and impressions.
Yeah, but it raises a very simple and fundamental question. Like, well, in that case, why is it so hard for everyone to not be able to critique or question the world as it presents itself to them? Like, instead, they have to get caught up in their powerful emotional responses about things. Wouldn't it be, and again, it's to do with the social teaching. How can we get people to realize that having a powerful emotional experience is actually a sign of psychological disturbance or a start?
Yeah, that's your business, Courtney. But you know, more fundamentally, yeah, I think people are not even at the stage in general where they recognize where some of the problems lie. You know, they're not. I would say probably in Epictetus' lectures as well, people would have been thunderstruck by the idea that everything they'd learnt from their parents was probably a misapprehension, a wrong valuation of impressions to do with, you know, health and wealth and status. So yes, I think it is countercultural. It probably was, and I'm sure it still is.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm talking about, is it's really countercultural. It's really disruptive. It's it sees the world in a way that turns the common perspective, the common opinion on its head. And the one who sees it that way sees themselves as performing a duty in doing so.
Yeah, perhaps it just comes back to the notion that there's no default to actually question it at the moment, because if we're looking at this as a way of life or increasing some of the knowledge, it's still quite a small domain, so it's not readily available. It relies on the person taking a step back to start making some judgments around the world, but that's not how we're socially constructed to do so these days. We just kind of go with the flow and we go into the systems that we're in, and that is a system that makes us put the incorrect judgment on things such as the value of money or status or what it is that we should do with our time. So in the absence of that being part of the TV shows that we watch or discuss or the heroes that we put forward, we have to get the knowledge out there, and then you have to stop and pause and think about it.
And isn't this a great thing? Like, we're reading an old text and it raises these really interesting questions. And these discussions must be the kind of discussions that people have had for hundreds of years over these sort of texts, right?
So perhaps we do need a painted porch in Brisbane.
Wouldn't it be great though to if we had enough information to do a bit of a kind of a survey of people who were known to be students of Epictetus and what they did in their lives, and whether they whether they were the purple or whether they kind of just went along, or unfortunately, with so many things from the ancient world, we're kind of scratching with very little information. But I mean, I suppose, well, Arian, I mean, the guy who wrote all this down, right? He was hugely active and versatile, and yeah, such an amazing person in his own life. So maybe, yeah, obviously it changed his life to hear these principles from Epictetus.
Do you know who I'd be keen to know what they thought about this? The slave who wrote it down for Arian. Because I think he would have been Arian going, come on, write this shit down because I'm listening. And the slave would have had his wax tablet out and he would have been writing this shit down, going, oh, that's really good. And yeah, oh, yeah, I'll try and capture that particular phrasing. And he was probably selected that slave because that guy was really good at note taking, you know, getting the gist of it. He's like, Arian would have been like, I'm going to a really good lecture today. I don't want that slave. He's shit. He's got a bad memory. I want that one because he's got really good memory and he's got a flair for, you know, stuff. So that would be interesting. That slave would have gone home and he would have seen his wife and children and gone, oh man, that was an interesting day at work today. So yeah, interesting.
That's hilarious. Yeah. Well, so you're saying you don't think Arian actually wrote it down himself?
No, I think I read somewhere that it's likely he would have had a slave doing the note taking.
Okay, I'll have a think about that. I was assuming it was Arian who wrote it all down, but
Maybe.
To go on a very quick slight tangent, I was listening to a podcast today and the historian was saying to slightly give some credit and then we'll take it away. But to initially give credit where credit was due, he said the Romans actually freed a lot of their slaves. But then he said, but it's probably because they got too old and weren't useful. So then you free them because then you don't have to provide or take care of them. But there you go. Something I
oh
didn't
well.
know.
So this is where Seneca letter, and I've forgotten which letter it is. Of course, I think it's maybe 50. One of them. Anyway, very important letter, but around a slave who was basically Seneca and his wife inherited her from an estate. You know, they didn't actually have any choice about this. She came as part of an estate. She's a former in-house entertainer, and yeah, has a disability and stuff like that. So yeah, she was a very vulnerable person, but they took her on because she was part of the estate and she became part of their household. So essentially, yes, while I'm sure there were a lot of slaves who were let go in a sort of heartbreaking circumstances, there were also cases where slaves were taken in where there was no kind of legal obligation to do so. So just making that point.
I could imagine that slave now just scratching that notes down and Epictetus saying, well, are you the kind of guy who holds the chamber pot? And the poor old slave's going, oh yeah, I did
What?
that this morning.
Oh yeah, God, that's funny.
But another thing in this text towards the end is how he talks about the bull and how the bull doesn't know its power immediately and has to come into knowledge of its power through training or whatever. And I think that's a really lovely thing about Stoicism is this concept of training and probably not expecting too much of ourselves, especially when we're young. And anyone who's got children will know this, that your children will sometimes get frustrated and be like, well, why don't I get it right all the time? And it's like, well, because you're a kid. Your brain's developing, you know, you don't know the things that adults know. You just seem to not realize that yet, you know, and there's a sense in that everyone needs to know that we're all a work in progress, you know. And I really find it, I wouldn't say frustrating, but I think it's unnecessary that when people get into Stoicism, they really fixate on this sage mentality. And it's like, oh, well, you know, I wonder what the sage would do, and I wish I could be more sage-like. But really, I like how Epictetus has a more developmental view, and it's like, well, and he says it right at the end, right? I'll never be a Socrates. But you know that I'm not going to give up trying just because I'm not as good as him, or a Milo who was an athlete, wasn't he, or Croesus who had lots of money. I'm not going to even really try and compare myself to those paragons of, you know, whatever they achieved. I'm just going to do my best and develop along the lines that my character allows me to and see how far I go with that. I just think that's a really natural and healthy attitude too.
I do like how it's phrased as well because it's not just giving up in a way. So he's like, well, I'm not Socrates, you know, but where I am is good enough for me, but that's not the end of it. He's still then talking about developing oneself at the same time.
And there's also a warning that's implied there, I think, too. And it's like, don't get ahead of yourself, you know? And I think that comes up elsewhere in the discourses, where he says something like, if you're a young man and you've just begun training and you see a beautiful woman coming along, get the fuck out of there. Because you're not ready to face those sorts of things just yet. And that's sensible, right? Like, start with things, especially when you're doing Stoic practices or training or anything like that. Start with little things and start working there and build yourself up. And like the bull, eventually you'll have the tone, the tonos, the muscles, the strength of character to be able to face death in the eye. But as a young man, that might be too much to ask for. Or a woman, sorry.
Yeah, 100%. Oh, I think he's very reasonable in that sense, and yeah, and kind of answers that question about, well, why don't we all do the right thing all the time? Well, obviously we have different abilities, different and different personalities, and yeah, we're at different stages, because not all horses are race horses, not all dogs are good hunting dogs. We all have different levels of capability, but that's not a reason not to improve. Yeah, I think it's a very positive message, and a very encouraging message. So, and I think that kind of counteracts, this idea that he's so negative and so confrontational and so rude and so abrasive. Well, he's actually he allows the space for encouragement, and cherishing almost of people at their ability, at whatever ability they're at.
Yeah, I've always found him, for me, he's my favorite because I take him as very serious and, well, not serious, but he gets to the point of the matter. He doesn't beat around the bush, but he's very humane. He's very much focused on caring for the soul of the person that he's lecturing to. And I just, to me, I feel that about him. I think that's a wonderful trait. Shall I do 1.3? It's a short one, yay! How, from the idea that God is the father of human beings, one may proceed to what follows. Part 1. If only one could be properly convinced of this truth, that we're all first and foremost children of God, and that God is the father of both human beings and gods, I think one would never harbor any mean or ignoble thought about oneself. Why, if Caesar were to adopt you, no one would be able to endure your conceit. So if you know that you're a son of God, won't you be filled with pride? As things stand, however, we don't react in that way, but since these two elements have been mixed together in us from our conception, the body, which we have in common with the animals, and reason and intelligence, which we share with the gods, some of us incline toward the kinship that is wretched and mortal, and only a few of us towards that which is divine and blessed. Now, since everyone, whoever he may be, is bound to deal with each matter in accordance with the belief that he holds about it, those few who think that they were born for fidelity, for self-respect, and for the sound use of impressions will never harbor any mean or ignoble thought about themselves, whereas the majority of people will do exactly the opposite. For what am I? A poor wretched man, they say. Or this miserable flesh of mine. Miserable, to be sure, but you also have something better in you than that poor flesh. Why do you neglect that, then, and attach yourself to what is mortal? It is because of this kinship with the flesh that some of us who incline towards it become like wolves, perfidious, treacherous, noxious creatures, or others like lions, wild, savage, and untamed creatures, or in most cases like foxes, or something even more ignominious and base. For what else is a slanderous and ill-natured person than a fox, or something even more unfortunate and base? Watch out, then, and take care that you don't end up as one of those wretched motherfuckers.
Yeah, so this is an interesting passage, and yeah, the very well said image at the beginning that, you know, people tend to boast about their connections. So if somebody was adopted by Caesar, well, you'd never hear the end of it. But in fact, we're all children of the divine. We all have that part of the divine in us. So he's reminding us of that. And so he's talking about our relationship to animals, our kinships. We've got kinships to do with the mortal, with the animal, but also with the divine. And people tend to, or the majority of people, he says, don't do the best they can. Again, with this heritage, they have, you know, mean and unpleasant ideas and thoughts and sayings about other people. But, you know, why would you focus, he's saying, on the miserable or the less valuable part of being a human, and rather than the more valuable part of being a human? So yeah, don't be like, don't be like, I mean, I must say, you know, these days we tend not to take the view that animals are, the likeness to animals is a negative thing. So in a way, this is a bit difficult for us now. But I think we can take it in terms that, well, you know, if you focus on being a negative person, then you're showing your likeness to negative and less worthy beings, rather than the more worthy beings. And that's what we should all aim at being. And it's useful to remind us that we do have this kinship to the animals as well as to the divine. But yeah, we've got a choice about which we are more like, I guess, or which we more imitate.
Yeah, and its connection to animals too. I know there's a longer tradition because you see it also in Plato, of course, and that's a more Pythagorean tradition, where I believe it is, where the soul could come back as a lesser creature. And in a way, you were looking after your soul by not acting that way. You'd devolve and become sort of wild animals and things like that. But also, you know, thinking a bit more in a more kind of Stoic way, rather than of these reincarnation type myths. Wolves and lions and foxes and things like that, and probably all animals, I assume, don't have moral considerations. They just respond to the world, you know, based upon their basic needs, right, for food and sex and sleep and things like that. But human beings aren't like that, and ought not to, according to Epictetus. So yeah, that's just an interesting point. Sorry, bit of a distraction here. And the other thing, of course, and I think it's a very interesting, I'd call it a psychological thing, is that if you really did believe that there was something really maybe sacred or important about the fundamental nature of being you, you know, that you're this rational being that you are, this subjective self, is able to make use of things in the world around it, and it's completely up to you how you do that, and that you've got that moral choice to do so regardless of any external opposition that comes your way. That's a wonderful and beautiful thing. And if we understood that with the kind of gravity that ought to come with it, then it wouldn't be insensible to think of it as like a gift from God, or having some sort of kinship with some sort of divine kind of being. I know I'm going to get into trouble, but if you did see yourself that way, what would be the psychological outcome of that? You would never feel bad about yourself. You would try and preserve that part of yourself and nourish it and act that way with fidelity. But if you don't have a concept of that in your nature, you don't think about that aspect of what it means to be you, a moral agent in the world, then yeah, you're in much greater danger of falling victim really to contingent kind of things. Like things go badly and maybe at some point you start to blame yourself and you start to see yourself as a failure and a terrible person, and that becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes, where, well, if I'm a terrible person, then I'll hang out with terrible people and I'll do terrible things. So yeah, I think it has really dramatic consequences. And I don't think the people who say, well, that sounds like a fantasy to think like that. I just don't think that that sort of that sort of fear that we're getting misled into some sort of I don't know, fantastical way of thinking about human nature. I don't think that that justifies the benefits that come out of actually thinking like this. Would you say so?
Yeah, I tend to agree. Yeah, I mean, again, it comes back to the fact that, this is all very countercultural, and counterintuitive, I suppose, for a lot of analyses that we find these days. Now, section 1.4 is quite long. I'm wondering if we should try and get to it tonight, or should we
No,
put
I
it off to next time?
think wait till next time. It is quite long. But just
Yeah.
before we move on, just talking about that, how important I think it is from a Stoic perspective to see human nature in a positive light, both in ourselves, in other people, and also the world. There's this thought that comes up quite a lot in CBT and rational emotive behavior therapy around core beliefs, and they break it into these three categories of world, self, and other. And you can even administer kind of like an assessment tool or whatever. And usually it'll come out that people probably have, well, you'll find that they've got certain, maybe they call them maladaptive beliefs about one of those parts, their self, others, or the world, or maybe it's all of those things. But thinking about how it's positioned here by Epictetus, you'd expect that the healthy view then, if you could somehow test people and get an accurate measure of what they actually thought about self, other, and the world, would come out pretty much like the ways in which the Stoics would like us to kind of have our final attitude, that we would see the world, for example, as a safe place where we couldn't be harmed, where we were at home in the world, and that we would see ourselves as a really positive, benign force in the world that seeks to be an agent of the good and help other people and all that sort of stuff. Somebody that we can even trust in ourselves, not having this sense that we're hopeless or a failure. And also in others, we would see them as a kindred kind of rational being who's just making their way in the world, not a source of anything to be afraid of and all that. It'd be interesting if CBT kind of looked at that more seriously, because they seem to be happier with a more kind of even spread. Like it's normal, they would think, for people to kind of be afraid of people sometimes because of past experiences and the like. But here we see, I think, a much more normative view of psychotherapy that wants to head in this very, again, countercultural direction to having a very strongly optimistic view of what it means to be a human being in the world. Do you kind of see that too?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm wondering whether whether our modern therapists would see Epictetus as actually knowing what the hell he was talking about, or whether he could do with some some modern therapy. But yeah, I mean, basically he's someone who essentially has it all together, right? And is able to communicate that in a constructive and vivid way to others. So yeah, I think it's a very powerful worldview, and I think he's a very powerful transmitter of it. And that's why we read him today and find him so powerful, I guess. But yeah, I think this idea of as you say, Courtney, the cosmos is positive is such a powerful concept, and of people as having far more agency than they tend to have any idea about, and that's what he's reinforcing. Is our agency, and and particularly coming from someone who was a slave and in less than ideal situations, that makes his message all the more powerful and all the more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you see it as a kind of therapy and a kind of cognitive restructuring, if you like, around core values, like to use modern language, for example, you can see some ideas for how you would approach such a therapy, and you'd imagine that he's going to do similar things. Like, for example, if it's true that somebody feels that the world is an unsafe place where they might be harmed or injured, well, then you have to restructure your thoughts about the world into something like, well, let's just accept whatever happens to us as if it was meant to happen. And the more you believe that, what's the result going to be? That you're not going to be alarmed by things in the world, that you're going to feel safe and at home in it, right? And another thing would be if you have fear of other people, well, how do you approach that? Well, you reinforce the idea deeply that you're not concerned with things outside of what don't belong to you, that other people are dealing with the same sort of things, and that they are a kindred rational being, and that we work together as if we were parts of a larger whole, as if we were fingers on a hand, or parts of a much larger body, those kind of ideas. And obviously the one relating to the self, where we can see a therapeutic intervention straight away. It's stop pretending that you're an animal and responding to pleasure and concerns about being punished with a stick or deprivation. Instead, focus on the fact that you're the one who gets to choose moment to moment what kind of character you have and what kind of human being you're going to be in the world. So that, I mean, to me, it's such a wonderful therapy in itself, without us having to then go necessarily and invent, take a modern therapy and then say, hey, let's cherry pick from the Stoics, because the Stoics already seem to have a very, very enriching therapeutic philosophy.
Yeah, 100%. It's incredibly rich, so we don't need to kind of shoehorn it into whatever framework we prefer. Yeah, it's just so rich. I think you're absolutely right, Courtney.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about those three that we read, or are you happy to wrap it up here? Travis, maybe you have something to say?
No, happy to end it there. It was a good last point that was made.
Oh, wonderful. So, well, I really enjoyed it, and I hope we can do it again in another couple of weeks, and we'll be at 1.4 and see how we go from there. Does that sound agreeable?
That sounds great. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Travis.
There you guys. Good night.